it's crazy, but it's
You're watching Channel Z, the world's leading zombie apocalypse channel. Broadcasting live from Studio Z.
Makes me act the way I do.
Good morning, intrepid survivors, and welcome to Go Bag Challenge. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Zarka. Today, we're changing things up a little. Instead of evaluating a contestant's go bag, we'll be having a roundtable conversation with James Breakwell and Dr. Steve Kirsh all about children and the apocalypse. How do you keep kids alive when everything's gone crazy? What does parenting even look like after the apocalypse? Hopefully, we'll find out today. But first, let's welcome our participants. James is a comedy writer and father of 4 girls. Wow. He's the author of Only Dead on the Inside, A Parent's Guide to Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse. Thanks so much for being here, James.
Thanks for having me. I love talking about the apocalypse. It's a great distraction, very uplifting topic.
Especially now, right? It seems a little too on the nose, but I'm sure you wrote Only Dead on the Inside, which great title, by the way. Things are maybe a little different, but thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And then we also have Steve, developmental psychologist and author of Parenting in the Zombie Apocalypse, the psychology of raising children in a time of horror. Thank you for being here, Steve.
Hey, it's a pleasure.
It's so great to have both of you on. And I should let our audience know that you both take completely different approaches to your book. So James, yours is more comedy. It has fun tidbits like how to defend your family from zombies using a stroller. Whereas Steve, yours gets a little bit more into development theory and sort of the nitty-gritty of psychological effects the apocalypse would have on parenting and children. But so 2 completely different approaches, but it's so interesting that you both decided to use the zombie apocalypse as the impetus to talk about parenting and children. So I'm curious as to why you chose that. James, let's start with you. Why zombies to talk about parenting?
Parenting is so hard on its own already. And so when I went to write a parenting guide, I didn't want to write about just raising kids in this ordinary world. So I thought, what's the most extreme scenario? Where would it be the absolute hardest to raise kids? I thought, oh, what about if people, you go to the grocery store and people are also trying to eat you? Like that made a lot of sense to me for some reason. So I set my parenting guide in the zombie apocalypse. And the startling thing I discovered was raising kids in the zombie apocalypse really isn't that much different than raising them in normal circumstances. And it all comes down to kind of taking your kids as they are, not as you want them to be. Because I think there's a myth on TV or, out there that like when the crisis moment comes, your kids are going to rise to the occasion and they're going to obey you and they're going to do what you say. And that's not how kids react at all. But you're always used to kids doing the opposite of what you say anyway. So if you just embrace that chaos, if you expect that chaos, I think it's actually going to be relatively easy to herd children through the end of the world.
I love that embrace the chaos. I feel like that's a general sort of go bag challenge show philosophy is you got to be prepared for the absolute worst. And you can't really control anything in this world, including your children. But Steve, what about you? Why zombies to talk about child psychology?
Well, I'm a huge zombie fan and have been since I was a teenager. And, as a developmental psychologist, I teach courses on child development, which involves parenting. I've also done research on media violence and looking into that. And I'm like, how can I combine all of the passions that I love together? And it came to like, oh, let's teach a course on zombies. And then I had to figure out, the hook. And for me, it was parenting because I knew enough about child development and parenting that I could see how it would go together. And the fact that there are not a lot of shows with kids in them suggests that parenting in the zombie apocalypse is going to be really hard. And by shows, I mean zombie shows.
As a horror and zombie fan myself, you're right. I feel like kids' movies are either dead or killing other people, creating chaos again, which seems to be the theme for this show. But so let's say the worst has happened. Zombies have risen, robots have taken over, aliens have invaded. The apocalypse has happened. What do you tell your children? I know both of you have kids. What do you tell kids when something terrible has happened, something apocalyptic? Steve, let's start with you.
I'm probably going to tell them that the cable's going to be canceled first and let them just deal with that. The fact that they're not going to have internet, they're not going to have cellular. After a week or so of that settling in and the realization that they're not going to be on social media, then I think you can start talking about all the things in the world they're going to start trying to kill them.
Interesting. So just make sure that they're not focused on entertainment and the internet. Yeah, because I mean, that's a modern technology we rely on so much, especially right this last year has proven not just entertainment, but education. So what happens when that's taken away? But James, what would you tell your kids if the apocalypse happened?
I think I would first tell them that the Wi-Fi was down, and after that, they wouldn't hear a single thing I said. That's the most devastating news I could possibly deliver. And honestly, with 4 kids home and no Wi-Fi to stream cartoons or to play games, I wouldn't even need to worry about the zombies outside because I have a riot inside my house. And then after that, assuming we survive the initial trauma of that announcement, I would just tell them what they needed to know on a need-to-know basis. Because really, things are local. Like how does it affect their lives? Kids are very self-centered. I mean, human beings are very self-centered, but especially children, because they don't have that filter to hide it. They're not good enough to lie about it yet. So I would tell them whatever they needed to know in that particular moment, and whatever I could tell them to kind of manipulate them into doing what I needed. So if I needed to tell them that the Wi-Fi is out, it's not my fault because people are eating other people, then I would absolutely throw that out if it made my life easier.
That brings up a question that we're getting from the audience. Both Pamela and Cristina have said, what do you tell kids? Do you tell them the truth? How much truth keeps them safe and how much terrifies them? Maybe, Steve, this is a good question for you. How much is too much when you're talking to kids about something so traumatic and scary?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about the actual end of the world with a zombie apocalypse, I think we have to throw emotional well-being out the door and not worry about that and focus more on what do you need to do to get your kids to be able to survive. They need to be able to hide from zombies. They need to be able to kill zombies. They need to be able to do things that they've never had to do before. So it's going to be tough, but I'm not so much focused on the thriving aspect of a zombie apocalypse. I'm focusing on the surviving aspect of getting your kids through it.
That's so interesting. I think that's, James, something you were saying too. It's not necessarily about creating community or worrying about the emotional well-being, like Steve said, right? It's just how do you get them to survive? So is fear sometimes a good thing for kids? Does fear help stay alive?
I think fear is always a good thing for kids, at least in the zombie apocalypse. Like, remember how I told you to be careful around strangers and you talked to all those random people anyway? Well, here's why we're not going to do that anymore. Just reinforce that all of the lessons I taught you already, now they have life and death consequences. And they can have life and death consequences in normal times, but now, it's much more likely. And I don't think we're teaching our kids anything right now that would make them not survive in other circumstances. It just, the zombie apocalypse kind of just ups the intensity of everything, and it really amplifies that message and stresses the importance of it. So yes, I think I would tell them the truth as long as they're old enough to understand, what death is and all of that. Like, hey, there are consequences for messing around now, and maybe don't do that. Would they listen? But I guess we'd find out.
And that's interesting because I know that's something to show my nerd side. In The Walking Dead, that's actually something that they struggle with, right? There's certain children that don't understand death. So they think that zombies are their friends, or that zombies are, just like their mom who died. And there's a level of maybe a lack of fear. But as one of the audience members said, right, there's a difference between fear and empowerment. But of course, we're on Go Back Challenge. So my philosophy is to always make sure that you are prepared. And so I think part of that means, maybe not shielding your kids from some things or giving them skills that they could survive. And there's different ways to do that. But I want to return a little bit more to like a psychological theory here. So Steve, can you explain, you talk about this idea of how fear can be productive or counterproductive in your book. Can you just briefly explain terror management theory and how the apocalypse might alter parenting for both parents and children?
So can I come back to that? Because there was one comment that I wanted to address that popped up a couple times. It was about mobility and panic and empowerment. And then, if we want to do the power, that's the one right there. Thanks. Sure. So the way we can get kids through this is we have to slowly desensitize them to the horrors around them. You have to, they have to get used to the fetid smell and the gross look. They have to be able to approach and get near without fear of being eviscerated. I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do, but there are some practical ways through specific types of games you could have kids develop so that the panic would fade away and you'd end up with kids that could be functional in the face of something truly horrifying. So,
what kind of games are those? What do those games look like?
Well, for example, let's say you want to have a kid who's going to have a hammer and they have to figure out how to smash a zombie's skull, right? That's a pretty gross thing to do. But you could start with them, smashing a gourd, right? You have little gourds, have them practice hitting that. And then you can, slowly introduce like zombie heads that maybe aren't actually moving. And once they can destroy those heads, then you can move your way up into actual zombie heads that have been decapitated but still have movement. So we got to get kids able to fight, and we got to get kids able to flee, and we have to get kids able to hide, but they need to do all of those things in a productive way.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you brought up the hiding, because I know, James, this is something you talk about in your book, right? Like hide and seek as a game that can actually be a way to teach kids to be safe. And I know one of our audience members also said that kids live in fear quite often anyway, right? So what does it mean when we're all, sort of in this situation? Like how can games like hide and seek be effective tools? And I mean, we teach kids things like stranger danger even now. So fear is part of children's lives. But James, talk to me about hide and seek. How can hide and seek be helpful for child survival in the apocalypse?
Well, hide and seek is definitely the ultimate shelter in place, avoid danger scenario. And my kids so when I first wrote it, my kids were, a few years younger, and some of them were just terrible at hide and seek. They'd stand there behind, a skinny pole, and you'd see the entirety of them. And then a couple of years later, there was just a total transformation. I know I had them play hide and seek just like in a 4-room area down here where there was nowhere where to hide, and I could not find them. I was shocked at how good they quickly became at that. So it comes naturally to kids. They're not always the most patient, but they can hide if it comes down to it. And I think that the key to that is probably something that would pertain to non-zombie scenarios too, is hiding is important, but it's just as important to hide someplace that you can get out of quickly, because no hiding place lasts forever. So if you hide yourself in the dryer and the zombie finds you in the dryer, well, there is no back door to the dryer. You're kind of in trouble. So I'm a big fan of kind of more open hiding spaces where maybe it's not, the most concealed place, but if they catch you, you can take off. And that's where panic really works to your advantage. I know there's that fight or flight human response. I come from a long line of flighters. Like that's, there's no hand-eye coordination in my family line, but we're all very fast and very, very prone to avoiding conflict. And my kids have that as well. So if, when the moment comes, their first instinct isn't to freeze or to hide, if it's just to dart off in a random direction, kids are short. You got to bend over. I think that's going to keep them safe. And the only zombie apocalypse I acknowledge is slow zombies. Fast zombies are blasphemy. So in a slow zombie scenario, yes, small darting children is the way to go.
I have to agree completely with that analysis. Slow zombies, there's nobody survives fast zombies. That's
a whole other animal, right? And I comments like hide and seek. Probably says a lot about me. I was exceptionally good at hide and go seek. I'm not athletic. I'm not fast, but I'm creative, and I would do things. This is sharing. I'd be in like a closet, and I would hide in the closet, but I'd put my feet in shoes in the closet and my arms like through the coat or like through a sweater. So when someone looks, you could look right at me, but they couldn't see me. But maybe that's also part of the strengths of parenting in the apocalypse, right? Is that kids are forced to use their creativity in ways that maybe they're not afforded now. I know you both mentioned that the biggest thing at first for the apocalypse would be telling your children that there is no more internet, no more cable. But maybe that would inspire creativity. So James, in your book, you call kids suicidally stubborn. How might this be an asset or a weakness in survival? Or could it be both?
I think it could definitely be both. So it's going to be a detriment when, you need to escape right then. Kids don't do anything on your timeline. They live on their own timeline. And we always think, well, at the end of the world, surely they would, buck up and they'd speed up things. But like, I can't tell you how many times we've had to get ready in time for something like super important, some not, mandatory engagement. We cannot get out of it. And that's when it takes them 2 hours to put on one sock. Like they very much have this internal time that slows down when you need them to speed up. At the same time, I think that if they want something, they want something, and that tenacity is going to keep them going. Where if they want the last snack and you've told them no, they're going to get it. Well, if they want the last snack and there's a zombie between them and the food, they're going to get through. They're going to sneak over, run around, do whatever. Kids are going to be amazing at foraging, especially if what they're foraging is pure sugar. I think we could really count on them for that.
I love that, right? Because those are the things that would actually not be spoiled. So maybe that's the secret weapon with kids is the sugar finders. But I did see a question from our audience member. Pamela's asking, when should we be teaching children in the apocalypse to obey or to learn to innovate? Is it better to inspire them to, kind of go off on their own and be these solitary beings? Or is it more important for them to follow your discipline? Steve, do you want to address that first?
Sure. I think it's a combination of both. Innovation is going to be the key to survival. So even like, if you're playing games and desensitizing them to blood and gore, you can have them like create their own weapon, to make sure that they can MacGyver things in order to survive. But getting kids to understand why you want things done and follow the rule, that's the whole process of socialization. That's what we're trying to get kids to do. And getting it to do in violent situations and in dangerous situations is going to be really hard on parents, because parents are going to want to impose discipline very quickly to assure the safety of their kids. So if that means they got to spank their kid to get them to stop right away, parents are going to do that. And I'm not saying this is an easy thing to do at all. And there are many parents who would be like, no, I don't want to spank. And so we're going to use other forms of discipline. Mm-hmm. Now, ultimately, in the long run, kids that don't like to be spanked. So, right, they're going to avoid the parent and become aggressive and violent. But maybe aggressive, violent children in the zombie apocalypse isn't as bad as, you might think.
That's so interesting, because we have talked about what the world expectations are going to be. And I know you mentioned socialization, and I think this is a particularly relevant topic right now, coming sort of out of COVID-19, which in many ways mirrored a zombie apocalypse in different ways. I know we've talked about it here on the Go Big Challenge before. So what do we do about socializing children in these apocalypse situations, post-apocalypse or apocalypse-like situation? James, I know you have 4 daughters, so maybe socialization is a little bit easier for you, but what's your stance on socialization in the apocalypse?
Well, I guess it is a lot like the COVID situation we just went through, because way at the start, my kids are like, well, why can't I go see my friends? It's like, well, the world is dangerous now. You can't go because there could be these consequences. And it would be exactly that same conversation in the zombie apocalypse. Why can't I go see my friend? Well, your friend might not be your friend anymore. They might be an undead monster. We don't know. So you've got to take precautions. And then once everything got figured out, once some people had already had it and recovered, or once, you figured out who had been quarantined and who wasn't, then you could kind of slowly reintroduce them to people. And really, my kids, they become much more social when the TV and the internet and those things aren't a factor. A few of them were grounded the other day and they couldn't, stream shows. And all of a sudden, they were playing with just a huge pack of neighborhood kids. It was like we were back in the 1950s. It's this swarm of children running around. So I think without entertainment options inside, kids are naturally going to want to socialize. And the first step of parents is to be like, okay, let's make sure they're socializing with people who are still alive. That's step one.
So true, right? And I mean, that's how parenting in the real world works too. It's, are the kids that your children playing with or going to their homes, are their parents safe? Like, is the household safe? But Steve, what's your stance on socialization in the apocalypse or post-apocalypse?
Yeah, I'm going for survival first and resilience later. So there's going to be some emotional consequence to learning how to survive in these very dangerous situations. And again, that's going to be to please no one. But, resiliency is something that can occur afterwards. And, if you have a high quality relationship with your child, you're still loving, you're still affectionate, but you're trying to get them accustomed to a very violent and vile world. I mean, that's traumatizing. Really, the zombie apocalypse is all about trauma. And so it's trauma-informed parenting. But there's not going to be a lot of trauma-informed parents, right? Because a lot of parents are going to be dead. A lot of parents are going to be dealing with their own trauma. And when we're stressed and when we're unable to handle the stressors that are going on around us, parenting suffers. Not for everybody. Some people are awesome and can keep doing it all, but for a lot of people.
That's so interesting, right? Because, okay, so we've been talking a lot about children, but what can and should parents be doing in an apocalypse? I mean, we've talked a little bit about how, you got to get the survival things down first, but when, how do you balance resource access with parenting duties? Does one take precedence over the other, or does parenting still rule out slightly because you are responsible for other lives? James, do you want to tackle that first?
I think they're all one and the same. I mean, if you're out getting resources, if you're out getting food, you're getting food for the entire group. Because truthfully, the way parents are wired, we're wired to protect our offspring first. We're going to throw ourselves between the zombies and the kids. If we run out of food, we're going to let the kids eat, and we're going to starve. So you're not staying alive unless the kids stay alive. I know there's that whole thing with a bear. A bear will let its cub die because then the bear can always have more cubs. I've heard that saying before, but I think that's apocryphal. I think in practice, that bear is going to destroy you. And they always say, don't get between a bear and its cubs. I think in practice, they're always going to protect it. So I think in the act of protecting yourself, in the act of acquiring resources, you are a unit. And especially when they're small and can't look out for themselves. I mean, those kids are an extension of you. They're really, as much as I might joke about them being expendable, they are very much not expendable. Trust me, my wife went through a lot of trouble to make those things. She does not want to have to do that again.
Do you all see any parallels in how the zombie apocalypse would affect children, like we were talking about, right? And COVID-19 now. We talked a little bit about socialization, but what other, similarities have you two seen as parents with just helping your children and, again, yourselves deal with COVID-19? Steve, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. I have psychologist friends, and what I'm hearing is there's more anxiety among children. There's more depression in children. As a college professor, I'm seeing a lot more students having difficulties with the managing of their education in terms of getting work done on time. So the stress and the lack of social interaction is taking a toll in very much the same way you would expect a toll to be taken during the zombie apocalypse. And for some, the only thing we're sort of missing is the post-traumatic stress. But for those that have unfortunately had parents or relatives die, that's going to be there too. So all of the elements are there. The only thing that's missing is people getting up to try to eat you.
Yeah, it's scary, again, the parallels that we see. But James, what parallels have you seen?
I saw a big difference there, and that was the biggest focus for me. So for me, the whole focus of the apocalypse is it was kind of fun. You didn't have to go to work anymore. Your kids didn't have to go to school. You didn't have to worry about getting them into a good college. Like all your obligations are just washed away. And the pandemic is kind of the worst of both worlds because it's like, okay, everything's shut down, but actually society's still running. We still have school. You're just doing school from home now. And also you're the teacher, but you're not the one grading it. There's somebody else there grading it, and you still have to go to work. You just have to go to work from home while your kids are also learning in the same room. So it had all of those things. So the freedom I was expecting just wasn't there. I mean, we didn't get the I guess the incredible violence and goriness of the zombie apocalypse either. So I suppose it's a fair trade-off. But yeah, overall, it was the end of the world was not quite what I expected.
I feel like that's probably what's going to be, right? And what we keep seeing is that, again, it's the chaos theory we were talking about at the beginning of the show, right? Is you can't predict what's going to happen with your children, with the world. So you kind of just have to prepare for the best. But let's talk a little bit about preparation. Do either of you teach any of your children any practical survival skills for, apocalypse scenarios, or is it more just these sort of psychological tools?
So my oldest, my 10-year-old is learning to cook. She really likes doing that. It's just simple stuff at first, frozen pizza, grilled cheese, all those things. But she's kind of got it in her head that if, my parents are occupied, I can cook a meal and I can do it for my siblings as well. And it's a survival skill. More importantly, it's a babysitting skill. There's a lot of overlap there. If my wife and I want to go out, we can trust her to keep herself alive and to keep her sisters alive too. And there's no downside to having them learn those skills.
Definitely. Steve,
and that's great. I was going to say that's great too, in case, one of the parents dies, then, the daughter's all set to take over the caretaking role, because it takes a village in a zombie apocalypse, not just to eat people, but, to raise.
Definitely.
And we had a day where we were just, it wasn't COVID, it was just a stomach bug that came through several months back. And for the first, usually, my wife and I have been lucky enough that one of us gets super sick and the other one's okay. And then a day later, the other one gets super sick. We trade off and on. And this was the first time we'd ever been that sick at the same time. We couldn't get out of bed. And we just told our oldest daughter, it's like, all right, you're in charge. These kids are your kids. We cannot get out of bed. And 24 hours later, they were still all alive. So I guess the system works.
Your skills have worked so far, right?
Yeah.
The training. Yeah. But Steve, this actually brings up another question for me, is that I know that there are different sort of milestones and skills that you need to be teaching children, or hope to be teaching them
Mm-hmm.
at different levels. So what changes in parenting, in an apocalypse where you have, let's say, an infant, a toddler, and a preteen?
Oh, wow. So like infants and toddlers, right? They're just screaming zombie bait, right? If you have an infant, you got to just build yourself a soundproof room, because you're not going to stop a baby from crying. It's just not going to happen. They cry all the time. You can soothe the baby, but then they're going to cry again. And that's just ringing the dinner bell. So you got to somehow find an isolation booth where you can, have kids. And toddlers, right? They scream all the time as well. And the screaming goes away at some point. I'm not 100% sure exactly when that is. But parenting is like the skills you can teach, like defense, cooking. All of those things are going to be survival parenting, as opposed to just simply saying, okay, let's learn all the presidents. Now it's going to be, all right, so what do you do in this situation? You're in an alley, there's a zombie coming at you. How do you take out its knee so it will fall down? Then you can put a shiv in the back of its head. Go. That's what you're teaching.
I like that. And thinking of teaching and education, I mean, that's one thing we haven't really touched on either, right? Is what does education look like in the apocalypse? And again, I feel like this is more and more relevant with COVID-19. And I know myself as a professor, I know Steve, you're also a professor. It's been interesting even just seeing essentially adults, right? That college-aged adults who are struggling with much more than they usually do. And I can only imagine that that's the same for younger children. And so how do we adapt as teachers, right? As educators, as parents, or that being the profession? Like, what do we do to make education better in the apocalypse?
I will say that our mini apocalypse here, COVID, it definitely made my appreciation of teachers go up 1,000-fold. Like just the things that they enable you to do when your kid is away at school, the things that they teach them that you don't have to teach yourself. Teaching is not an easy thing. It is an art and a skill, and they do it masterfully. When it fell back to me, I was not pleased with the result. I think in the apocalypse, I have to imagine that teaching, first of all, it focuses more on practical skills. We're not going to worry about memorizing lists of presidents. We're not going to worry so much about calculus. I can't imagine that's going to come into play too much when beating back the undead. But I think it's going to imitate what a lot of people did already with those learning pods, where you get a couple families together and you have one parent or a couple parents take turns teaching them, which makes all the sense, because you can't have everybody teaching their individual kids all day, because then there's nobody going out and digging trenches and scavenging for food and all of that. So I think as isolated as these things make us become, I think the key to survival is going to be cooperation, especially when it comes to teaching, both to help your kids learn and to give those parents a break, because the apocalypse is stressful, and spending 24 hours a day with your kid is probably not survivable.
Steve, just like you were saying, it really does take a village. But what have you noticed different in education, or what do you think we can learn from our pseudo-apocalypse of COVID-19 to apply for future education for children and adults?
Yeah, I think getting the kids to know one another is going to be really important. One of the difficulties we have is when you're doing remote teaching, and the teachers are doing an amazing job. And I was floored with how great my daughter's teacher did. But she really missed out on, because she was 100% remote, socializing, meeting up with other kids and those sorts of things. So as James pointed out, you're going to need to have your pods, where you're checking everybody's temperature, of course, and looking for bites. But you got to make sure that they can get together and be kids.
I have to end with this comment here from Erica in the audience. Childhood is a construct of the 20th century. As a historian, I can confirm that. And I think that's one thing we tend to forget, right? Is that we, because of the modern society, at least in developed countries, we have the luxury of children being able to be children and not have to necessarily pick up on the practical skills that were once not only necessary, but expected from children. Do you all think we need to be thinking a little bit more antiquated in that sense? Or do you think we should just embrace the modernity and let kids be kids?
I think it's probably too late. Like, I've already taught my children to be largely useless in a safe world, and transitioning them to be hard and fast killers in the apocalypse is probably not going to happen. That's going to be more of a generation 2 or generation 3 thing. Generation 1, the best we can hope for is just to kind of get them to adulthood alive, and maybe they'll do better with their own kids.
kind of all we can hope for, right? For kids, just hope people get old enough to take care of themselves. All right, with that, unfortunately, we have to end, but I would like to thank you both, James and Steve, for such a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on. And thank you to our audience for watching. Stay aware, stay prepared, and we will see you here next time on Go Bag Challenge.
It's crazy, but it seems so logical. I can't deny that there is something supernatural with you. Makes me act the way